Welcome back for the fourth and final season of Beyond the Venue podcast. When I started this project almost 4 years ago, I had absolutely no idea that I would be the one navigating beyond the venue by returning to the classroom. Before diving into my second year as a doctoral student, I figured it was a great time to wrap up this podcast by offering my listeners a variety of perspectives and experiences of life in academia. This semester, you'll be hearing from my friends, colleagues, classmates, and more, all of whom I've had the pleasure of working with since my return to Temple University a few years ago. Let's hear from them now. My guest today is Dr. Sabina Neugebauer. Good morning, Sabina. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm thrilled to be here.
I am so thrilled we were able to make this happen. You were one of my professors that I had this past spring. So actually, as we're recording this, the episode has dropped today of the remainder of our class. So there were only 4 of us in Learning to Read. It was 3 literacy students, and that I believe you work with several of them as their faculty advisor. And so I got the chance to interview them. So making meaning of meaning making, I think is the episode title. So I'm glad you were able to make the time. Super excited about this interview today. So okay, so we met in the spring of 2024. You are our Learning to Read professor. And kind of our first introduction to you was you're like, oh, let's share a fun fact about ourselves. And so you went first. Sabina, would you like to share with our listeners what your fun fact is?
My fun fact. Yes. Which is my background in theater, that I was the original Vanessa in Lin-Manuel Miranda's In the Heights. Which, it makes sense that someone who went into education and teaching might also have a theatrical background.
It makes perfect sense. And all of us looked around at each other. I'm like, I don't know. I speak German. And I honestly, because I was so far removed from recording episodes of the podcast, that I forgot that I hosted a podcast, which that would have been a fun fact. So heretofore, that is my fun fact.
I have been in multiple of his shows.
And that's amazing. So one of the things I did want to bring up that Young, who was in our class, he brought up the way that he ended up at Temple was he really enjoyed an article that you wrote, or you were cited in an article that he had read. And so he reached out to you, and that was the end of that. So I'm super excited that kind of worked out, because everybody's got a different trajectory. And so I would love to hear about your trajectory. What's your backstory? How did you end up at Temple, and why literacy?
Sure. So maybe to start, it's helpful to describe what I do and then work backwards, the research that I do, and work backwards for what drove that work.
Sure.
Does that make sense? So broadly, my research focuses on the language and literacy development of multilingual learners. And I look at their literacy development, both what I like to talk about as the skill and will of reading, and very much because, specifically as it relates to vocabulary and motivation, because those are 2 malleable aspects of their schooling, but that also have really large consequences for their long-term trajectory in school. And I've always looked at this, at language and literacy development across 3 units of analysis. The individual, so, why do certain students succeed in certain contexts and others don't? The classroom, so what practices in the classroom are effective for supporting students' will and skill for reading? And also at the school level. So how can schools engage in school-wide efforts to improve literacy? What tools can they use to empower students through reading? And, I've always been really passionate about reading and about multilingual learners. In part, it's personally driven. My grandparents are refugees who came to the US. My mom came when she was 6. And my mom entered a school system and her parents had trouble navigating that school system because they didn't speak the language. And both of her parents had academic, one of them was a teacher, the other was a journalist in their country before they came, and their wisdom and their knowledge was unable to be accessed and capitalized upon when they got to this country. And, that made them very vulnerable. And I think that really impacted my interest in serving students who arrive at school speaking a language other than English. And in many ways, that's driven my path and my interests. And my mom is a voracious reader, and that was really empowering for her. And, was very excited about sharing her love of books with me and my sister. And we grew up in a household where there was lots of storytelling and reading, and that was always a source of love and positive memories. And I want that for other students. I really see literacy as this social justice space and a space for empowerment. And so how did I get to Temple? Where should I start?
Well, let me ask, I'm curious,
Yeah,
did you grow up in a multilingual household then? Did you
I
speak
I
multiple
did.
languages?
I did.
I
And I
laugh because my mother, she said I would have loved to have like raised you like to be able to speak like multiple languages, but she herself did not speak anything other than
yes,
English. So it
yes,
was
yes.
up to
And
the school system to teach
yeah,
me other languages.
totally. Well, and now I have a multilingual household. My husband speaks Portuguese and Spanish, and my daughter spoke Portuguese until she was about 3 when she entered school. And so we're hoping to bring back both languages. Um, so yeah, I mean, and I have done so much work in linguistically diverse schools. So when I went, I did my doctoral work and was very focused. What drove me at that time was really understanding how to create better assessments and so support teachers in better being able to distinguish between a language difference and a language disability. That at the time
Interesting.
there
Okay.
was there's still an interesting literature on this where, especially upon school entry, of trying to distinguish, is a student, a multilingual student, struggling because they're acclimating to a classroom that is in another language. And there's also a group of students, a certain percent, of course, who are also going to struggle, have learning struggles, and determining at what point and how you determine what's a language difference and what's real difficulty.
Was that
Um,
the focal point of your dissertation?
that is what got me to want to return to doctoral work, but my dissertation actually took a very different turn. And I'm happy I was, in preparing to sort of think about our conversation, um, I was thinking about this idea of sort of how you come up with a good idea when you're in a doctoral program.
Oh,
And that I think
preach.
that's kind of the major work of a doctoral program is thinking through how you come up with a good idea. And I was thinking about how so much of my doctoral experience was both having this mission to transform a space in education, but also recognizing that to do that, I had to start with smaller innovations.
Hmm.
Get excited about more circumscribed pieces in order to do that work. And I think that is a good goal for doctoral study, of sort of saying to yourself, I have a mission to transform. In my case, I was very focused on equity and serving multilingual students and thinking about areas in which, and it became vocabulary and motivation, where I felt there was a space in the literature for me to potentially make a difference. But in some ways, my doctoral dissertation was stimulated by something very small. I had read an article by faculty at NYU about their use of, I can't remember if it was beepers that would go off for students to fill out a survey about their identity. And I was very interested in motivation and understanding how motivation played a role in students' engagement in literacy instruction in school. And it stimulated my, initially, it was like a methodological interest of, oh, what if I got kids these watches that would go off at the end of the class and when they got home to ask them about their motivation at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, oh, you know, at that stage, I had been interested in capturing motivation in this more dynamic way. But in many ways, there were little small, um, there were these mini steps along the way where I was picking up spaces where I felt I could innovate and be novel to capture a larger problem space that I was interested in. So,
You're like literally speaking to exactly like where I am right now.
yes, yeah,
And so that's exactly where I am specifically with like motivation and identity and working with Dr. Kaplan with the
yes,
DSMRI and like how your identity and like that exact moment in time, like how that will impact your decision making.
mhm,
So something that but that's good advice too for me to hear is kind of like that start small to be able
yeah,
to impact bigger change.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Interesting. Well, okay. So we'll
Okay,
come back.
so
So
we'll come
let's
back. Yes. So how did I get to Temple? Is
how
that
did
the
we get to
question? Is that
Temple? How
the
did we
okay?
get to Temple?
You know, I had a postdoc, then I had my first faculty position at Loyola University Chicago. I really, when I saw the posting for the position at Temple, I was really, really excited because I was eager to scale up my research. I wanted to be able to do some of the intervention work and to think more in terms of school-wide models for implementing professional development. And I knew that Temple would be a place where I could do that. As you know, often in the academy, when you move jobs, it is a wonderful opportunity to have an additional influx of resources because that is how you leverage additional resources and support. And also Temple was a research one.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, it was also in, you know, an urban area where I would have lots of wonderful schools with linguistically diverse populations.
Mm-hmm.
I was very excited about the city. And when I interviewed, I think one of the major, I don't know, game changers in my deciding that I wanted to come was I met multiple faculty with whom I knew I would be able to collaborate. And I think that really, and who would be wonderful colleagues. And I think something that has been wonderful in my career is that at each place, I've been now many places because I was at UConn, at the University of Connecticut for my postdoc, then at Loyola University Chicago, now here, is that in all of these places, I have been able to collaborate with other scholars who I think we had very complementary lines of research, but also pushed each other either methodologically or in terms of the lens that we use to analyze our data and I think that has been really wonderful for me as a way to grow as a scholar. And I think that's a really important part of the work that we should do as academics, especially when we're doing work in schools.
Yeah, I can't speak highly enough about the faculty that I've had the pleasure of interacting with over the last couple of years being at Temple, like the College of Education and Human Development. Like we've got some excellent folks, and it's
Yeah.
been really cool to get involved in studies with professors like across like all the different disciplines,
Mm-hmm.
because everybody's got their own area of expertise. And so I love that it's not like we're not siloed, and
Yes.
even folks reaching across the university, and obviously with research, you're working with folks all around the world. Well, we're super excited to have you as a faculty member at Temple. So I'd love to know, like, we're kind of gearing up. We're a couple weeks into our fall semester. How's your semester going so far? And like, what are you working on right now? What classes are you teaching? What kind of projects and research projects and other things are you getting yourself involved in?
Sure. So I can tell you about a couple of things I just completed, what I'm working on now, and some of my classes. So I just finished my book with Emily Phillips Galloway and Christina Dobbs, Reimagining Language Instruction, New Approaches to Promoting Equity, which is really centered on providing teachers with strategies for teaching language and also provides insights for principals and school leaders about how to think about language instruction that highlights the assets of students and also provides guidance for thinking about how we can give students tools to empower them to engage with complex curriculum.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I just finished a podcast with my collaborators, Tamara Snead and we are the principal investigators of a $3 million grant to support schools in serving multilingual learners of English. And it is a model that really works with different groups in the schools. And so it works with leaders and teachers and families to provide professional development around strategies for multilingual learners. And it has a podcast that's particularly directed to leaders. And it's basically intended to take the research on evidence-based practice and to make it consumable in your commute to work. So they're
That's
20-minute
really cool.
podcasts,
Okay.
and it takes some of that research and just talks through it, provides some statistics, some core strategies, so that, by the time you get to the office, as opposed to reading a report,
Right.
we're in their ear talking through it and some of our experiences. And
So it's like podcast as professional development.
yes.
I
And
love
so,
that. That's so
yeah.
cool.
So that's part of our model for the portion that is for leaders. Eventually, we're hoping it will be shared. It's currently only being used by those who are enrolled in our project, but we're hoping that it will be able to be disseminated more broadly. We've already gotten some requests from some schools, I guess, because people are talking positively about it. So we're hoping to be able to disseminate it more broadly. And
So I guess that's a question I have is so someone like myself who knows nothing about the work that you're doing for this grant,
mhm.
would this podcast make sense for someone like myself, or is it just like strictly geared towards like in collaboration with the work that's being done at the schools?
No, I think anyone would find it well, I'm entirely biased, but I think anyone who is eager to support multilingual learners in schools, and
Mm-hmm.
even folks who aren't but are curious
Mm-hmm.
about how schools function, I think it's a wonderful podcast to learn more about the culture and climate of schools, the kinds of instructional practices that are supportive of learners, and the role that families play, and
Mm-hmm.
how we can invite them in to really leverage their knowledge and assets as well. And so, the podcast really covers all of that ground, which is part of this larger grant to support schools to develop this sustainable model where we work with these schools for 2 years, but that once we are no longer at the school is able to sustain this kind of professional development and support for multilingual students. and to make these schools just, welcoming places for multilingual learners. So that has been a huge portion of the work that I've been doing now, is focused on this grant, and developing these really wonderful collaborations with schools. Some other work that I've been doing, I've increasingly become interested. A lot of my work has been on vocabulary, and
Hmm.
the majority of the literature on vocabulary is monomodal, meaning is predominantly focused on one mode by which you're communicating language, your oral communication. And I'm increasingly interested in multimodal ways that teachers support students through gesture, through visuals when they're reading a book. And so some of the work that I've been doing now is also really understanding how teachers enact these various modes to help students make meaning in more comprehensive ways as they read.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking about a read aloud where a teacher is kind of acting like a conductor of using their hands and their words and the picture on the page to help students to make inferences and link ideas in a book that may have unfamiliar vocabulary or complicated story structures.
Yeah, this
So,
is something I talked a lot about in the podcast with Young, Janine, and Drew, was that, I want to continue to teach in higher ed or older. And
mhm,
so learning how little, and I don't have kids, and so like
mhm.
I don't intend on working with children. And so it was a very kind of like rough start to the semester for me in the spring, because we're learning about parsing and syllables
Totally.
and all of this code based
Mhm.
meaning that for me was very overwhelming and kind of like
Yes.
hard to kind of wrap my head around. Why am I learning this? But honestly, it was super interesting, and like your passion for that subject really came through. So it's like I'd get excited about it because of the way that you would talk about it, even though it's not something I necessarily will be teaching or using in the future, but kind of like it also an interesting way to see kind of how students can get to like where we are now and maybe have a better understanding of what someone's possible past could be if their literacy skills aren't as strong by the time they're coming to the university level.
Mhm. And I think, you are not alone. Many people are required to take that class that I think come in and take it because it's a requirement, but reading is not their passion. And a developmental perspective is not necessarily one that they wish to take in their work. And what I love so much about that class is that I think it takes people on a journey of
Yes.
rethinking how language and literacy are so central to everything that we do. And it also, I think, links literacy to equity and self-empowerment in a provocative and powerful way. And I also think it makes the topic feel very sexy in the respect that it's filled with controversy. And
Yes.
I think for many people who are not in the literacy field, it feels like we've resolved it. We know the answers, right? And of course, there are many areas in which there is controversy, even right now with the science of reading, where we
Hmm.
have this pendulum moving back and forth between which approach to reading is the approach to take. And so I think what's wonderful about the class is I think it really gets people to rethink the role of literacy and the spaces in that field for making a difference, or for at least considering it in the work that they do in some
Hmm.
capacity. And I really enjoy that over the course of the semester to see how different students are seeing literacy as in some way related to what they do, or alternatively, just recognizing that there may be a similar space for them in their own work in terms of recognizing, using a developmental lens, or going a totally different direction and seeing this as, most fields, there are these unanswered questions, and it's about really distilling where is the space for innovation in those fields. And I think that's modeled in the course of the course.
Yeah, it definitely, I feel like things got more easy. They got easier for me and more digestible, like once we moved into the second half and started getting into the meaning making. And
Yes.
then by the time, I got to present on reading motivation, I was like, okay, we're in
I got
motivation.
it.
I'm here.
Yes. Yes.
So, which really opened the door to a lot of different ways of thinking for me. Was it Sarah Jones that was the author? That like questioning the way that we are testing students. And so that was kind of a new idea for me. And so it kind of led me down a different path, just to kind of start questioning our systems.
Yes. And I mean, and I also think what, you can tell me whether you found it enjoyable about the class, but I think the articles, because there are these areas where there is considerable controversy, disagreement, having these different articles and scholars who are arguing for these different positions, I think actively reminds you that you yourself need to be in dialogue
Mm-hmm.
with scholars, and that the doctoral work is about seeing this as a conversation, that when you consume an article, that you're having this dialogue back and forth with the author. And I think this class, because I often, pair authors who have divergent views, it facilitates this seeing it really as an active discussion, which I think is really useful, because then it makes you feel that you're part of it and that potentially have something to contribute to that discussion.
That's why I appreciated, we were tasked every week to come up with a question, I believe. So it's like, how are these two articles like speaking to each other? And
Yeah.
so I feel like it really helped with like your critical reasoning skills and critical thinking skills to see, okay, these two folks are saying two different things, but like what is my takeaway here? What do I think about this?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's something I'm really trying to continue to improve upon. Um, but what are there other classes that you're teaching this semester?
So this semester I'm teaching TESOL 5631, which is the Foundations of Language course, focused on, not surprisingly, strategies for supporting multilingual learners in the classroom. It's an asynchronous class. So
Okay.
that's, I always say in the beginning of the class, it is funny for me to teach this course because so much of my research is on the power of back and forth exchanges.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it has been a really wonderful experience for me to work in the asynchronous space of trying to figure out how to make it as interactive as possible, particularly on a topic that's about pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. How are like so I am curious like how have you um enacted how the students are interacting with one another? Because I struggled with this. My second semester as an adjunct, I was teaching team processes, and it had been 100% in person my first semester. And then I was told that in the fall that Tuesdays would be asynchronous, Thursdays would be in person.
Mhm.
And I'm like, but it's team processes. How do you like we need to
Is
be
really
learning about
challenging.
teamwork.
Yeah.
And so I had gotten some advice from friends about how to implement some activities in order to keep them engaged with one another and engaging with the material. So what are some strategies that
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
using?
yeah, so I think some of it is, peer projects where they're working together on a project presentation. You can still have presentations in the asynchronous environment, having these more animated discussions. But I also think it's about having a continued dialogue, both between students, but also with the professor. So I think what can often happen in an asynchronous environment, because they're often modular, right?
Hmm.
You have a set of modules, is to see them as distinct and sort of a conversation that's in the past. And so I both try to find ways for assignments to relate to each other in a way that it brings up past discussions, have students who are engaging, bringing back past material, but also, and this, again, I think some of it that's been challenging is also the feedback from the professor, because it doesn't feel like a continued iterative feedback loop, is that I always engage in some kind of synthesis when students have responded. Let's say it's a discussion post and they post their ideas and it's an animated discussion, but to make it feel like it's still alive, so to speak, I always have a Friday synthesis from where I'm going through, pulling their ideas, drawing their attention to other students' remarks. So even though the discussion has closed, there's this continued way of keeping it alive, of returning to it, and for me to also have an opportunity to synthesize it in a way that I would in a classroom discussion, which I think sometimes can be missing in the online asynchronous space, because I do think part of the scaffolding in a back and forth exchange is that the professor and also peers. I mean, I think that's part of it too. It's about sort of recasting or synthesizing or distilling ideas and points. When you've had an animated discussion, there are so many points that are made. And so it's good to have, I think, that space to distill some ideas. And I try to make spaces for students to do that as well.
Is there any component where there are any like Zoom meetings, or is it just
Yes.
100%
No,
do this
no,
on? Okay.
but again, for many people who take asynchronous courses, they choose, this is a required course, but I always ask in the beginning during some introductions, how people have experienced asynchronous environments, what
Hmm.
works for them, what doesn't work for them. And often, folks will say it is the fact that I can do this anytime, anywhere. I still offer synchronous opportunities
Okay.
for students, and I do towards the latter part of the class have opportunities for every student to meet with me that wants to talk about their lesson plan, which is part of one of the final assignments. But again, those, because of the nature of um, the population that may be taking the course and that they have different schedules,
Hmm.
I can't, it's always an optional synchronous opportunity. But often, I will, even with quizzes in the class, I always, there's a back and forth exchange. Everything ends up being more of a conversation. It's not as though, you submit something, uh, and that's the end of the conversation.
Well, you're definitely excellent with the feedback. I can
Oh, maybe
you very,
Zoom.
very thorough with the feedback. Very, very helpful. So, well, do you have any advice for graduate students? So either master's, doctoral, like kind of any maybe something you wish someone would have told you when you were going through this, or
Yeah.
anything for us to kind of to think about?
Yes. I guess a couple of things. I mean, one is share your work with each other, even if you feel like it's not even a first draft. I cannot say how important it is to collaborate with peers and share your work. I found that tremendously helpful during my own doctoral experience. And it mirrors other processes in the academy. You will have to submit your work to journals for
Hmm.
revision. It is a good practice to get feedback from each other, and it's a wonderful way to grow your own ideas and learn from others.
And this is
And
like in a form of like a writing group.
So I always had a writing group. It could be a writing group. It could be you're just in a class together
Hmm.
and maybe the class doesn't forge collab. It could be a quantitative class. It could be, it could be a variety of different classes. But I think the idea of sharing your work either through some kind of formal writing group or in a class to share assignments that you're working on, I think is just really helpful for your own scholarly development. And it's a good muscle to get used to getting feedback because you then start to internalize it and you can predict in your own work spaces for improvement. Um, and so that has been really valuable. And during my experience, I've had two writing groups, both filled with wonderful female scholars that had very different methodological approaches. And it was tremendously useful, both for my productivity, but I think for my thinking as a scholar. So I would definitely say that is a major piece of advice. And also to reach out to faculty as much as you can too. I think often students are hesitant to do that. And I think that is faculty are a resource and they can tell you not just what's coming next, but what's coming after what's coming next. And I think it's good to have a larger sense of your greater trajectory.
Well, that's why with our graduate community programming, so like these are the social community building and professional development events that we're doing. The For the month of October, all the events faculty are encouraged to come. So we can try and facilitate more collaboration and community between graduate students, staff, and faculty.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think some graduate students might be intimidated, or I'm not really sure how folks are feeling, but I wanted to provide this platform for people to feel a lot more comfortable, to be able
Mhm.
to interact with faculty that you might not have met before.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's wonderful.
Awesome. Any other advice?
I think my advice would differ depending on what that person's goals are. If they want
Yes,
to
that's
stay in the
fair.
academy, what they want to do, do they want to go into a nonprofit? Are they hoping to return to schools? I think the advice would differ. I think there are different things to take advantage of when you're in an academic setting, depending on what your ultimate goals are. But
I
I would
think
say the collaboration piece is true across.
absolutely. I think that's great advice all around. All right, we're going to switch to talk about the world of hospitality. I feel like almost every time I was going out to dinner somewhere throughout the spring semester, you're like, oh, I've been there, or I just went there. And so I know you have a mutual love of our wonderful hospitality scene here in Philadelphia. So one of the things that stuck with me, I always share a Google form with my guests to kind of get to know a little bit more about them. And one of your passions, you listed desserts with four contrasts, and this blew my mind. Please tell me more information about this.
So I deeply enjoy desserts that are hot, cold, wet, dry. So think about like a brownie sundae, right?
Okay.
Hot brownie, cold ice cream, cold, wet ice cream, or, apple crisp. That's hot apple crisp with, some kind of pecan vanilla ice cream, whatever it is. I just think those contrasts are so delicious. Um, and
Do you have more of a sweet tooth as opposed to a savory tooth?
I have a very significant sweet tooth. Yes.
Okay. So you're the kind of person that might skip the appetizers to make sure you have room for dessert.
Definitely. And I've become totally and completely obsessed with second daughter brownies. Have you had
Okay.
if you haven't, you should. They're amazing. So yes, I take desserts, pastries very seriously.
It's we are very fortunate. So someone who, as myself, is lactose intolerant and gluten intolerant, we
Oh,
do have some like High Fidelity is
yes.
outstanding, and Okie Dokie Donuts is all gluten free, and then they have
Oh,
a couple vegan options.
interesting. Yeah.
So we are lucky to have those folks. But I know that Philly is home to we got Machine Shop who won a James Beard Award. So we
Yes,
have a
yes.
lot of
In there.
outstanding pastries that
Yep.
I can no longer enjoy for the time
Oh,
being, but I'm glad they're there for everybody else.
yes, yes.
Well, do you have any favorite restaurants that you've been to lately or anything that's on your list that you're looking forward to trying?
So I just went to Bloomsday Cafe. Have you been there
Yeah.
in Hidden House Square? It was
Yeah.
I found that so delightful. It was
Mm-hmm.
so so wonderful. Love the atmosphere. Um, I tend to like venues and restaurants that bring the outside in or the
Mm-hmm.
inside out. So,
So does that
like
mean like greenery
yeah,
or
definitely. Greenery. That's why I like,
sunlight, big
yes,
windows?
I love those PHS pop-up garden. Like
Mm-hmm.
all of any time where there can be, yeah, greenery, nice lighting, um, really impacts my experience. Soraya isn't like have you been to Soraya?
Yes.
So lovely. There's all these places in Fishtown. I'm making a plug for Fishtown, I guess. Um, that have that kind of aesthetic and also have amazing food. So Soraya is one of the places where I love their food.
Yeah, it seems like everybody was opening up in Fishtown instead of like coming down here to South Philly,
I know.
which was such a bummer. But at the same time, I feel like there's like some interesting things going on in Fishtown where folks are closing
Yes.
um for various reasons. But I think I'm very kind of curious to see what Fishtown's going to look like 5 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because
sure.
it's I feel like there's spots that aren't going anywhere, but like I was even disappointed to see that Martha's going to be closing
Mhm.
in November, which they have this most like there's been so many micro weddings that have taken place in their
Yeah.
gorgeous backyard
Yeah.
space. So
Yes. Oh, that's another one. Have you been to Green Valley Inn at the West?
yes,
Like
as I
that.
have attended multiple weddings there.
Oh, interesting. Again,
And
green,
yeah,
beautiful. Yeah, and wonderful food.
and it's funny because it's such a weird spot to get to, but
It
only
is a really
because
weird.
of the nature of where it is situated, that it is in the middle of Wissahickon Park.
Totally.
And so yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful venue.
Yeah.
Well, do you have an ultimate favorite venue? This is
So
me putting my MG, the venue
I was
specialist hat on.
I was really struggling with this
And
because
as everyone has struggled with this on this season, and so I always tell my guests there's no wrong answer. This is
um
absolutely whatever is in your heart.
I feel like um what so you have to remember, I moved to Philly and then not that long after was the pandemic.
Okay.
Oh, I feel like my feelings about venues are also all outside
Oh,
because
yeah.
that was such a formative time in my living in Philly, where it felt like there was the most vibrant activity because those were the places where we could engage in vibrant activity. And so even places like Bartram's Garden, I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely love. There were outdoor events there. There was a honey event. I Bartram's Garden has all these like hidden gems, and every time I've been there, something spontaneous and magical happens. And I love that. I love when venues are controlled at some level. The beauty is, but then really amazing, unexpected things happen. Like the last time I was at Bartram's Garden, there was a loose horse running through, and it just felt like
Classic Philly.
incredible, where we're like, is that a horse? And it was just like running around up and down the hills. There was also someone, I think, chasing it with a lasso. So again, it's like it's this something about the unpredictable quality, but also that it just is a.
But it's also where it's located. It's very interesting because you're going through kind of oil refineries and
Yes.
West
Yes.
Philly until you get to this like gorgeous waterfront property. And
Yes.
so I know because that's been also a very popular wedding venue,
Interesting. Yeah.
that I know that that's been conversations that I've had with couples of, if you're getting a shuttle bus from like, let's say like a center city hotel to bus your guests to the venue. I think the guests, especially ones that aren't familiar with the venue, who aren't
Yeah.
from Philadelphia, that it's like, where are you taking us? This is an interesting view. What is happening? But then you get to the beautiful space. And so the last time I was there was actually kind of one of the last couples I had worked with as MG, the venue specialist. I had taken the couple lived in New York. And so I was taking the parents and showing it, but there was an event at Bartram's that day. So it was like
Yeah.
very specific where you could park. There were people everywhere. There was a lot of hubbub. So it's like, it will not be like this on your wedding day. But you're right, they're constantly like doing things and events and activities. So I
Yeah.
think that's an excellent answer for a favorite venue.
Thank you. Yes. And you have to remember, like, I'm a New Yorker by birth. So the idea that 5 minutes away is this incredible green space is really magical. I think. So I'm also influenced by that it's like close enough to me and you can both experience, you're still in an urban space, but there's this incredible greenery. Same, I mean, that's also true of the Schuylkill, but doesn't have the same, it's spread out.
It is because you got the Schuylkill River Trail and like some cute parks around there. We've got Fairmount.
Yeah.
That's massive. So
Bartram is a different feel. It might be the
yeah.
swing that's hidden. Again, I feel like there's like a magical quality for young and old there. I don't know.
I love it. Well, Sabina, thank you so much for joining me today. Congratulations again on the new book and the podcast, and obviously the grant as well. That's huge
Thank
news as
you.
well because those are never easy to get. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode from the fourth and final season of Beyond the Venue podcast. New episodes of this final season will drop on Fridays throughout the fall semester. Follow Beyond the Venue podcast on Instagram for details and updates about each episode and stream all 4 seasons on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks so much for your support.